day everyone, myself Mani Dublish, Assistant Professor in MC Department, AKDC Ghaziabad. Today my topic of presentation is Spring Boot, which is related to WebTech, KC021 MC students, also applicable in Java. So before starting, first of all, I would like to tell you what is Spring Boot Actuator. So Spring Boot Actuator provides secured endpoints for monitoring and managing your Spring Boot application. By default, all actuator endpoints are secured. So before using Spring Boot Actuator, first of all, we would like to enable Spring Boot Actuator. So how can we enable Spring Boot Actuator? To enable Spring Boot Actuator endpoints to your Spring Boot application, we need to add the Spring Boot starter actuator dependency in our build configuration file. So Maven users can add the below dependency in your pom.xml file, and the syntax is the dependency. We will mention the group ID and artifact ID, and by this we can start our Spring Boot actuator. So in the application.properties file, we need to disable the security for actuator endpoints by the syntax is management.security.enabled is equals to false, and if we want to use a separate port number for accessing the Spring Boot actuator endpoints, add the management port number in the application property files, and the syntax would be the management.port is equals to 9000. Now we can create an executable jar file and run the Spring Boot application by using the following Maven or Gradle command. So for if we use Maven, we can use the following command in ambient clean install, and now we can run the jar file by using the following command jar, java jar and jar file. So now the application by default has started on the Tomcat port 8080. Note that if it is point to be noted that if we specified the management port number, then same application is running on two different port numbers. Now some Spring Boot endpoints are given below, so we can enter them in our web browser and monitor our application behavior. So first of all is our matrix. So what is the we have some endpoints like matrices, env, beans, health, info, trace, etc. So what is the use of this endpoint? So matrices, we used matrices to view the application matrices such as memory used, memory free for using threads, classes, and system uptime. And we used to view the list of the environment variable used in the application, and we can use beans to view the Spring Beans and its types, scopes, and dependency. And health we used to view the application health, and info to view the information about the Spring Boot application. And we can use trace to view the list of the traces of your REST application. And now the question arises, what is Spring Boot runner? So Spring Boot provides two runner interface, which are application runner and command line runner. Both of these runner are used to execute piece of the code when a Spring Boot application starts. So both of these interfaces are functional interfaces, which means they have only one functional method in order to execute a specific piece of code when Spring Boot application starts. So we need to implement either of these functional interface and override the single method to run. So basically, application runner is an interface used to execute the code after the Spring Boot application started. So the we can understand this Spring Boot runner through the implementation of the application runner interface on the main class file. So this is basically the syntax by which we can implement a Spring Boot runner in our application. Through this, first of all, we have to build this library, and then this is we learn the Spring Boot application, and by this we can override the Spring Boot application runner. So now the question arises, what is Logger? So Logger is an API that provides the ability to trace out the errors of the applications. When an application generates the logging call, the logger records the event in the log record. So after that, it sends to the corresponding handlers or appenders. So some Spring Boot logger gives you the following information like date, log level, process ID, logger name, thread. So logger message. So now what is the functionality of this Spring Boot logger? So through date and time, Spring Boot logger gives the date and time of the log, and through log level it shows the information, error, or any kind of warning. Process ID of our Spring Boot application ID. If we want to make any kind of separator, then that time we will use this. And thread name is enclosed within the square brackets, and logger name that shows our source class name. And finally, the log message. So now, what is console log output? So as we understood earlier, the logger, which shows the log message. So now I want to tell you about the log message. How can we print this log message? So if we want to print the log message, then we will use the console log output. So the default log message will print to the console window by default info, error, and true one log message. This will print in the log file. If we have to enable the debug level log, add to the debug flag on the starting your application using the command shown below, and the command is java zar demo.zar debug. And if we can also add the debug mode to our application properties as shown below. We can say our debug values is equals to true. Now, how can we building RESTful web app service? As we know, Spring Boot actuator, Spring Boot basically we use to provide to create the APIs. So now the question arises: how can we build these RESTful web services? So Spring Boot basically provides a very good support to building RESTful web services for enterprises applications. So for building a RESTful web services, we need to add the Spring Boot starter web dependency into the build configuration file. If we are a Maven user, so we use the following code to add the below dependency in our pom.xml file. And this is the code dependency. We will mention the group ID, and we will mention the artifact ID. In group ID, we will mention the code org.springframework.boot, and in artifact Spring Boot starter.web, and the dependency would be closed. Now the question arises: what is the REST controller? So the REST controller annotation is used to define the RESTful web services. It serves JSON, XML, and custom response. And the syntax is @REST controller public class product service controller. Next question is request mapping. So the request mapping annotation is used to define the request URI to access the REST endpoints. If we can define request method to consume and produce object. So the default request method is get. So request mapping value is equals to products, and the public response entity by through object we can get the product. So the request body annotation is used to define the request body content type. So the syntax is the public response entity object, and we can create product through request body product. Okay. Now next is path variable. So the path variable annotation is used to define the custom or dynamic request URI. So the path variable in request URI is defined as curly braces. The syntax is public response entity object name we will mention, and we will update product at the rate. We will mention the path variable and this ID and this string ID, and the parenthesis would be close. Now the request parameter. So the request param annotation is used to read the request parameter from the request URL. So by default it is a required parameter. We can also set default value for request parameter as shown below. As shown here, I have mentioned keep public response entity object name get product. Here we will mention the request param and value is equals to name, which we mention any name, and requirement is equals to false, and default value would be, I have mentioned here honey, and name here is strict name. Thanks. This is how we can make RESTful web services through the Spring Boot actuator. That's enough from my today's lecture.